Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: The Silent Catalyst. In the sweltering heat of Miami's summer in 1973, Jim Harris adjusted his stiff, freshly pressed uniform and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. At 26, Jim was still getting used to the weight of his responsibilities at the Oak Ridge Juvenile Detention Facility. The sprawling, weathered building, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire, stood as a grim reminder of the troubled souls it housed. Jim wasn't new to hard work. He had spent years balancing his college classes in psychology with various odd jobs. But this was different. Here, the stakes were higher, and the consequences of even minor mistakes could be dire. The kids in Oak Ridge weren't just wayward teens. They were criminals, some of them with charges that belied their age. On his first day, Jim was paired with Frank Peterson, a grizzled veteran of the detention system. Frank had a knack for assessing people at a glance, and he was quick to offer advice. "The kids in here aren't just bad, they're smart," he warned as they walked through the facility's dimly lit corridors. "You let your guard down, they'll eat you alive." As Jim passed row after row of barred cells, he tried to mask his unease. Some inmates shouted insults or banged on their doors. Others stared, their faces blank, as if already resigned to their fate. But one inmate caught Jim's attention. Cell 14 housed Alan Grayson, a wiry, pale boy with sharp, piercing blue eyes that seemed too old for his 17 years. Unlike the other inmates, Alan didn't shout or cause a scene. Instead, he sat cross-legged on his cot, reading a battered book. "Who's that?" Jim asked Frank, nodding toward the cell. Frank's expression darkened. "That's Alan. Smart kid, but dangerous. He doesn't fight or scream, he gets in your head. Stay clear if you can." Jim frowned but said nothing. Something about Alan's calm demeanor felt out of place in the chaos of the detention center. Over the next few days, Jim kept his distance, observing Alan from afar. The boy had a strange influence on those around him. Other inmates, even the more aggressive ones, seemed to defer to him. Guards reported that Alan rarely caused trouble, but when he did, it was never physical, it was psychological. One evening, as Jim walked past Alan's cell during rounds, the boy looked up from his book and smiled faintly. "Good evening, Officer Harris," he said, his voice soft but clear. Jim stopped, startled. "How do you know my name?" Alan's smile widened, but he said nothing. The next few weeks brought a series of small but unnerving incidents. Jim began noticing little things. Papers moved on his desk, his locker left slightly ajar, and once, his coffee mug placed on the opposite side of the break room. At first, he chalked it up to his own absent-mindedness. But the feeling of being watched persisted, especially when he was near Alan. The boy's behavior was never overtly threatening, but his presence felt oppressive. One day, during a group therapy session, Alan demonstrated his unsettling charisma. The session, led by a counselor named Dr. Morgan, was meant to encourage the boys to open up about their struggles. Most of the inmates remained sullen and uncooperative, except for Alan. With calm precision, Alan steered the conversation, subtly undermining Dr. Morgan's authority. He asked probing questions about the counselor's personal life, leaving Dr. Morgan visibly flustered. By the end of the session, the inmates were laughing at the counselor's expense, and Alan sat quietly, his faint smile betraying a sense of satisfaction. Jim watched from the back of the room, a knot forming in his stomach. Alan hadn't raised his voice or made any direct accusations, but he had managed to turn the room against the counselor with little more than his words. The turning point came on a humid Friday evening. Jim was patrolling Block C when a sudden commotion broke out. Inmates were shouting, banging on their cell doors, and throwing anything they could get their hands on. "Block C is rioting," came a frantic call over the radio. Jim and Frank rushed to the scene, where chaos reigned. The air was thick with noise and tension. Inmates screamed obscenities, their voices echoing off the concrete walls. As they moved through the block, trying to restore order, Jim noticed something strange. Amid the pandemonium, Alan stood motionless in his cell, his arms folded across his chest. His lips moved, but his voice was drowned out by the clamor. Curious and uneasy, Jim stepped closer. The noise around him seemed to fade as he strained to hear what Alan was saying. Then he heard it. 555-3487. 555-3487. It was his home phone number. Jim froze, his blood turning to ice. How did Alan know that? The riot was eventually subdued, but Jim couldn't shake the incident. That night, as he sat at home, the phone rang. He snatched it up, half expecting to hear Alan's voice on the other end. But the line was silent, save for the faint sound of breathing. After a long pause, the caller hung up. Jim's wife, Linda, noticed his unease. "What's wrong?" she asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Nothing," Jim lied, forcing a smile. Over the next few days, Jim tried to piece together how Alan had obtained his phone number. He reviewed security footage, questioned other guards, and even checked his personnel file for breaches. But no answers emerged. When Jim finally confronted Alan, the boy's response was maddeningly cryptic. "You'd be surprised what people reveal when they're not paying attention," Alan said with a shrug. Jim's frustration boiled over. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. Alan's smile returned, colder this time. "Nothing at all. I just like watching people squirm." The incident marked the beginning of a psychological battle. Alan's influence seemed to grow, even as he remained confined to his cell. Guards started reporting strange occurrences. Misplaced items, unsettling graffiti, and whispered rumors spreading among the inmates. Jim, determined to maintain control, began documenting every interaction with Alan. But the boy's actions were always subtle, never overt enough to warrant disciplinary action. One evening, Jim received another unsettling call at home. This time, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Good night, Officer Harris," Alan said softly before hanging up. Jim slammed the phone down, his hands trembling. He knew he couldn't let Alan win, but the boy's calculated mind games were wearing him down. As the days passed, Jim realized he wasn't just protecting the facility from Alan. He was protecting himself and his family from a threat that went far beyond the walls of Oak Ridge. The days following the unsettling phone calls were tense. Jim Harris, determined to maintain professionalism, buried his anxiety under layers of routine. His shifts at Oak Ridge Juvenile Detention Facility became mechanical, each task a distraction from the creeping sense of unease that Alan Grayson had sown. Still, the young guard couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just Alan anymore. Other inmates seemed more attentive, their eyes tracking him as he moved through the block. Even the veteran guards, like Frank Peterson, noted the subtle change. "Something's in the air," Frank muttered one morning as they prepared for roll call. "Feels like the calm before a storm." Jim nodded but said nothing. He had begun to realize that Alan's influence extended far beyond his cell. One afternoon, a sharply dressed woman arrived at the facility. Introducing herself as Catherine Miller, a social worker assigned to review inmate rehabilitation programs, she requested access to several case files, including Alan's. Jim escorted her to the administrative office, where she began flipping through records with clinical precision. As she worked, Jim couldn't resist asking, "What's the story with Alan Grayson? He seems different." Catherine glanced up, her expression thoughtful. "Alan is highly intelligent, but his records suggest a pattern of manipulation. He thrives on control, using his intellect to exploit vulnerabilities in those around him." Her words confirmed Jim's suspicions, but they also deepened his unease. If Alan's behavior was this calculated, how far could his influence reach? That evening, as Jim prepared to leave for the day, Frank pulled him aside. "You need to be careful with Alan," Frank said, his voice low. "He's gotten to other guards before, pushed them to their breaking point." Jim frowned. "What do you mean?" Frank hesitated, then continued. "A few years back, there was a guy named Rick, good guard, steady. But after a few months on Alan's block, he started slipping. forgetting procedures, losing his temper. One day, Rick just snapped. Quit on the spot. The story sent a chill down Jim's spine. He couldn't let that happen to him. Over the next few weeks, Jim found himself at the center of a series of unnerving events. One morning, Jim discovered that several of Alan's case files had been tampered with. Pages were missing, and annotations in red ink, ones Jim didn't recognize, had been added. When he reported it, the administration dismissed it as a clerical error. Jim began finding cryptic notes in his locker. Written in neat, precise handwriting, they contained phrases like, "Everyone has a weakness," and "Control is an illusion." The most chilling incident came when Jim found a Polaroid photo tucked into his car's windshield wiper. It was a picture of his wife, Linda, taken outside their home. Each incident escalated the tension, but there was never enough evidence to point directly at Alan. Determined to confront the issue head-on, Jim decided to engage Alan directly. During his rounds, he stopped outside the boy's cell. "Alan," he said firmly, "we need to talk." Alan looked up from his book, his expression calm. "Of course, Officer Harris. What's on your mind?" Jim hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Alan's smile was maddeningly serene. "Doing what, exactly? Don't play games with me," Jim snapped. "The notes, the photo, you're behind it." Alan's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe I am," he said softly. "Or maybe you're just imagining things. Either way, it seems I've gotten under your skin." Jim clenched his fists, but he knew better than to lose his temper. Alan thrived on control, and anger would only feed his power. The following day, Jim arrived at work to find the facility in turmoil. Overnight, several inmates had coordinated an elaborate prank, rearranging furniture, smuggling contraband, and scrawling graffiti on the walls. The messages were unsettlingly personal. "Harris can't protect anyone," and "What's yours is mine." The administration launched an investigation, but the inmates refused to talk. When questioned, Alan merely shrugged and said, "Chaos has a way of creating itself." Frank pulled Jim aside later. "This has Alan's fingerprints all over it," he said. "He's testing you." Jim nodded, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let Alan win. Determined to regain control, Jim began studying Alan's file in detail, looking for any weaknesses he could exploit. He learned about Alan's childhood, a series of foster homes, abandonment, and betrayal. But the deeper Jim dug, the more he realized how little was known about Alan's true motivations. The boy's psychological evaluations were contradictory, painting a picture of someone who could adapt to any situation. Jim decided to take a different approach. Instead of reacting to Alan's provocations, he would observe, waiting for the boy to slip up. One night, during his rounds, Jim found Alan's cell eerily quiet. The boy was sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the wall. "Something on your mind, Alan?" Jim asked cautiously. Alan turned slowly, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You've been digging into my past," he said. "I hope you found it enlightening." Jim's pulse quickened. "What do you want from me?" Alan stood and approached the bars, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not about what I want, Officer Harris. It's about what you fear." The following day, Jim's worst fears were realized. Linda called him at work, her voice trembling. "Jim, someone's been watching the house," she said. Jim's heart sank. He knew Alan couldn't physically leave the facility, but his influence clearly extended beyond its walls. That night, Jim made a decision. He would do whatever it took to protect his family, even if it meant bending the rules. Jim began working closely with Frank to monitor Alan's every move. They installed additional cameras, reviewed logs, and scrutinized visitor records. But Alan always seemed one step ahead. He continued to manipulate those around him, using his charm and intellect to sow discord. Jim knew he was running out of time. The web was tightening, and Alan's endgame remained a mystery. Jim Harris sat in his car outside Oak Ridge Juvenile Detention Facility, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Alan Grayson's words echoed in his mind. It's not about what I want, Officer Harris. It's about what you fear. Linda had called again that morning, her voice strained. Someone had left another Polaroid in their mailbox. This time it was a picture of their son, David, at the park. Jim knew Alan was behind it, but there was no solid evidence, just an ever-tightening web of psychological warfare. Taking a deep breath, Jim exited the car and headed toward the facility. He was determined to end this once and for all. Inside Oak Ridge, tensions ran high. The inmates were restless, and even the guards seemed on edge. Frank Peterson, Jim's closest ally, warned him to tread carefully. Alan's playing a long game, Frank said. He wants you to crack. Don't give him the satisfaction. But Jim was struggling to hold himself together. His focus had shifted from protecting the facility to safeguarding his family. Every noise at home felt like a threat, every shadow a potential danger. One evening, chaos erupted in Block C. Two inmates, incited by a whispered conversation with Alan, started a violent altercation. Guards rushed in to contain the situation, but the chaos spiraled out of control. Amid the pandemonium, Jim noticed Alan standing calmly at the center of his cell, watching the scene unfold with a faint smile. It was as if he were orchestrating a symphony of destruction. Later, when order was restored, Alan was questioned. He denied any involvement, claiming he had been quietly reading. His cell was searched, but nothing incriminating was found. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another move in Alan's game. Desperate for answers, Jim reached out to Catherine Miller, the social worker who had reviewed Alan's file. They met in a small cafe, away from prying eyes. Alan thrives on control, Catherine explained. He manipulates people to feel powerful. But he's not infallible. Everyone has a weakness, even him. What is it? Jim pressed. Catherine hesitated. Alan's weakness isn't fear. It's isolation. He hates losing control of the narrative. If you cut off his influence, he'll unravel. The advice gave Jim a sliver of hope. He needed to sever Alan's connections, both inside and outside the facility. Jim devised a plan with Frank's help. They would isolate Alan completely, restrict his interactions, monitor his movements, and cut off any outside communication. The administration was hesitant but eventually agreed after another series of incidents linked to Alan's influence. Alan was moved to a solitary confinement cell, stripped of privileges, and placed under constant surveillance. At first, Alan seemed unaffected. He sat quietly in his cell, reading or staring at the walls. But as days turned into weeks, cracks began to show. He became restless, pacing his cell and muttering to himself. One night, while reviewing surveillance footage, Jim noticed something peculiar. Alan had been writing notes and hiding them in the bindings of his books. Jim and Frank searched the cell and found a series of cryptic messages. Most were meaningless scribbles, but one note stood out. The puppet only dances when the strings are pulled. The discovery confirmed Jim's suspicions. Alan had an accomplice outside the facility. Someone was executing his plans on the outside. But who? A breakthrough came when Linda called Jim, panicked. Someone just left a note on our porch, she said. It says, "Time's almost up." Jim rushed home and examined the note. The handwriting matched Alan's, but it didn't make sense. Alan had been in solitary confinement for weeks. How was he still orchestrating these threats? Determined to find answers, Jim decided to confront Alan directly. Jim entered Alan's cell, his heart pounding. Alan looked up, his expression calm but his eyes burning with intensity. "You've been busy," Jim said, holding up the note. "Care to explain how you're pulling this off?" Alan smirked. "You underestimate the power of influence, Officer Harris. A well-placed word can move mountains." Jim slammed the note onto the table. "This ends now, Alan. Whatever game you're playing, it's over." Alan leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "You think isolating me will stop the game? The pieces are already in motion. You can't stop what's coming." Jim left the cell, shaken but determined. He reviewed every detail of Alan's case, searching for a lead. Finally, he found it, a name. One of Alan's former foster parents, A man named Charlie Monroe, had a criminal record for fraud and extortion. Charlie had visited Alan several times before Alan's isolation. Jim was certain Charlie was the outside accomplice. Working with local law enforcement, Jim set a trap. Posing as a vulnerable target, he leaked false information about his family's whereabouts. Sure enough, Charlie took the bait. In a dramatic raid, Charlie was arrested, and his connection to Alan was confirmed. Investigators found detailed plans for targeting Jim's family, all written in Alan's handwriting. With Charlie in custody, the threats stopped. Alan, now truly isolated, began to unravel. His calm facade cracked, and he became increasingly erratic, screaming at the guards and refusing food. For the first time, Jim felt a sense of victory. The nightmare was over. Months later, life began to return to normal. Jim and Linda took extra precautions, but the fear that had once consumed them slowly faded. Alan remained in solitary confinement, his influence diminished. Without an audience, his power was gone. Jim reflected on the ordeal, realizing how close he had come to losing everything. Alan's words still haunted him, but they also served as a reminder of his own resilience. In the end, Jim had faced his fear and won. But he knew he would never forget the boy who had nearly destroyed his life, not with brute force, but with quiet, calculated manipulation. The game was over, but the lessons would last a lifetime.